Hi there everyone. This is the video for the 3.11 lesson, The War at Home. For the second time in less than 25 years, the United States was embroiled in a world war. Desire for neutrality vanished overnight with the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. The ranks of the nation's armed forces swelled and U.S. factories began producing war materials at rates no one imagined possible. Women joined the workforce, while African Americans fought in segregated military units overseas and hoped they could defeat Jim Crow at home. As in World War I, actions by the federal government raised constitutional questions regarding civil rights. This time it was Japanese Americans who came under suspicion and suffered the consequences of prejudice and wartime hysteria. Goals for this lesson: explain the ways in which the United States rose to the challenge of meeting wartime production needs. Recognize the role of women in war industries and the impact their role had on them over time. And lastly, summarize the constitutional issues surrounding the U.S.-Japanese internment camps. And that will be your assignment for today. Your graded assignment is about the constitutional issues in the Japanese internment camps. Okay, before we begin, please go to the lesson resources and get your reading guide and or lesson answer key. And then if you want to, while you're in here, also grab and print off, or you don't have to print it off, but grab, save, print, whatever, the graded assignment primary sources, because you'll need that for your graded assignment. Okay, what do we need to do today? Read pages 722 through 728, complete the reading guide, complete the Democracy Denied Japanese Internment Activity Online, and complete the graded assignment. So let's start with the lesson reading, page 722. Okay, starting arming for war. The United States was grossly unprepared to fight a war on two fronts, in both Europe and the Pacific, because we have Germany being the aggressor nation in Europe, and then in the Pacific you have Japan. So this was a new challenge as well, fighting on two fronts, or as they called them, theaters of war. In the aftermath of World War I, America had largely disarmed. Now the nation had to summon all its economic and industrial might to supply millions of troops with the tools they would need to defeat Germany, Italy, and Japan. FDR called on Americans to build 185,000 planes, 120,000 tanks, and 55,000 anti-aircraft guns over the next 2 years. He also urged the establishment of a new wartime industrial economy that would provide the United States with a crushing superiority of equipment to defeat the Axis powers. And here's the picture at the bottom right. B-24 bombers were churned out in great numbers in the production line at the Ford Willow Run Creek plant. As he set out to arm the United States for war, FDR did what he did best. He improvised to meet new challenges. He created federal agencies like the War Productions Board, responsible for assisting civilian factories with retooling for military manufacturing. He enacted policies like cost-plus contracting, which guaranteed factory owners a profit if they agreed to shift from making cars or sewing machines to making airplanes and guns. At FDR's urging, the Army and the Navy formed public-private partnerships with leading corporations such as General Motors, General Electric, and U.S. Steel to meet the demands of wartime production. FDR's call to arms was daunting, but Americans rose to the challenge. Businessman Henry Kaiser established a Liberty Ship plant in Richmond, California, where in just 105 days workers produced 440-foot-long vessels, able to carry 300 freight cars, 2,840 jeeps, 440 tanks, and 230 million rifle rounds. Some call the Liberty Ship the Model T of the seas, highlighting the country's successful application of assembly line production methods to war manufacturing. At the age of 78, Henry Ford established a new factory along the Willow Run Creek in Michigan. There, thousands of men and women who once built cars now churned out 8,500 B-24 bombers for the U.S. Army Air Force. A visitor to the Willow Run plant reported that it was impossible to convey the feel and smell and tension. The roar of machinery, the special din of the riveting gun absolutely deafening nearby, the throbbing crash of the giant metal presses, the far-reaching line of half-born skyships growing wings under swarms of workers, and the restless cranes swooping overhead. FDR challenged the United States to become the arsenal of democracy, and its citizens did just that. But building ships and planes was just part of the challenge. The Army also needed 250 million pairs of pants, 500 million socks, and 250 million pairs of underwear for its growing ranks. It needed tents, parachutes, bullets, and billions of K-rations, prepackaged food, cigarettes, and chewing gum for the troops. To prevent factories from running short of the raw materials needed to produce these goods, the federal government rationed resources such as oil, synthetic rubber, and aluminum. To make sure there was enough food to sustain the troops, the government also restricted civilian purchases of meat, coffee, and sugar. Americans carried ration books to the grocery store where they had to produce both money and coupons to buy such items. To ensure the smooth flow of wartime production, FDR struck a deal with labor unions. All war production plants would be closed shop, which meant that workers had to allow their workforce to join unions. In return, union leaders accepted wage freezes that would last the duration of the war. As a result, the number of union members soared in the early 1940s, setting the stage for major changes in the post-war American economy. The shift to a war economy led to the end of the Great Depression. FDR's administration borrowed enormous sums of money, which is spent on financing military manufacturing. Factories swelled with workers and the unemployment rate plummeted. Even though most Americans were now back at work, they were unable to spend much of their wages. Rationing prevented civilian workers from buying more than their share of staples, and factories are churning out more planes, tanks, and guns than consumer goods. Years of Depression-era scarcity, followed by wartime rationing, would leave the American public hungry for comforts and luxuries whenever peace returned. And if we look at this chart up here at the top, men and women in uniform, 1936 to 1944, each green person there represents 200,000 military persons. Look at the dramatic increase during the war years. It's just, especially by the time you get to 1944, huge dramatic increase from the pre-war time. The war economy required a steady supply of workers. With more than 11 million men in uniform at the height of the conflict, the arsenal of democracy welcomed women into the civilian workforce. They answered the call, filling traditionally male jobs as welders, miners, and crane operators. 19 million women accounted for a third of America's total wartime workforce. Some 2 million women worked in factories producing ships, planes, and ammunition. The Roosevelt administration's War Manpower Commission embarked on a campaign to urge America's women to do their part by working in the war industries. The commission crafted the image of a female war production worker known as Rosie the Riveter. Though the image of Rosie the Riveter struck a chord with the American people, most women entering the workforce in World War II worked in traditional female positions as secretaries and stenographers. Many worked as volunteers. Some 350,000 women worked in the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps, WACS, the Women's Accepted for Voluntary Emergency Service, WAVES, run by the Navy, and women's branches of the Coast Guard and the Marines. Many American women also volunteered for the Red Cross and other organizations that aided servicemen. At the war's end, masses of women lost their jobs because they had been hired only for the duration of the war. Most went back to the more traditional roles of homemaker, wife, and mother. But the experience of working in war production had lasting consequences. For the first time, married women outnumbered single women in the workforce. Many women came away with a sense of financial and social freedom that laid the foundation for changes in traditional gender roles after World War II. And here is the very famous poster of Rosie the Riveter. Very common image, we can do it. Showing a woman rolling up her sleeves, willing to put forth her efforts for wartime production. Homefront USA, changes and tensions. During the war, 1 of every 9 Americans left home for basic training in military camps. Millions more relocated to find work in war production. All told, 1 of every 8 people, approximately 15 million Americans, changed their country of residence during the war. Some 20% of the American population lived in a different location at war's end from where they had lived when the war began. Americans had a variety of reasons for moving during the war years. Many wanted to go to work in states like California where they could find good jobs in defense industries. Between 1940 and 1950, California's total population expanded by almost 75%. With war production centered in the big cities of the North and the expanding cities of the West and Southwest, millions of Americans were willing to pick up and relocate to Los Angeles, San Diego, Seattle, Chicago, and other urban areas. Civilians on the home front also embraced an array of new ways to participate in the war effort. Many planted victory gardens, participated in scrap metal and tinfoil drives, and adhered to government rationing and price freezes. Others volunteered with the Civilian Defense Corps, serving as air raid wardens and auxiliary firefighters, or took to the skies in their private planes to search for German submarines off the Atlantic seaboard. Most Americans also felt the reach of the federal government as never before. Though the government borrowed heavily to finance the war effort, it also raised taxes. Whereas few Americans paid income taxes to the federal government before World War II, now most did. Moreover, the government began withholding taxes from workers' weekly and monthly paychecks rather than accepting a lump sum payment at the end of each year. The war effort helped to transform the South. Hoping to boost the region's economy, the Roosevelt administration located many military bases and more production factories in the South. This helped start the transformation of the old Cotton Belt into the post-war Sun Belt, a prosperous region that eventually attracted millions of new residents after the war. African Americans excluded. FDR's vision of democracy in wartime did not include civil rights for African Americans. When the nation went to war, blacks were prevented from pursuing a variety of economic opportunities. With rare exceptions, defense industries refused to hire African American workers. One steel corporation in Kansas City declared, "We have not had a Negro worker in 25 years and do not plan to start now." Labor unions excluded African Americans from their ranks, while the Army restricted blacks to the most menial jobs. In the Navy, too, blacks served as stevedores, messmen, cooks, and stewards. African American civil rights leaders such as A. Philip Randolph, head of the all-black Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, urged Roosevelt to integrate America's racially segregated armed services and defense factories. When FDR refused to take that step, Randolph vowed to organize a protest march of 100,000 Negroes on Washington in 1941. Faced with the prospect of massive demonstrations in the streets of the nation's capital, Roosevelt issued Executive Order 8802, which barred racial discrimination at defense plants and established the Fair Employment Practices Committee to investigate complaints and provide enforcement. The FEPC was understaffed and underfunded, and it largely failed to remove the barriers of racial discrimination that blacks faced in war production facilities. But it did establish the groundwork for a post-war civil rights agenda that included equal employment opportunities as one of its main goals. Fighting for Double V. Many Americans were aware that German government was brutally oppressing and murdering millions of ethnic minorities, particularly Jews. Many blacks came to believe that by serving in America's war against the Nazi state, they were striking a blow against the American racism too. The Pittsburgh Courier, a popular black newspaper, gave voice to the aspirations of hundreds of thousands of black servicemen and civilians when it called on African Americans to pursue Double V, victory against fascism abroad and Jim Crow at home. Many military bases were located in southern states. Black soldiers and sailors who had grown up in northern cities were unaccustomed to segregation and protested their exclusion from buses, movie theaters, and restaurants. A black GI spoke for many of his peers when he remarked, "Right on my tombstone, here lies a black man, killed fighting a yellow man for the protection of a white man." As increasing numbers of Southern blacks earned wages as servicemen or war production workers, they were able to break free of the cycle of dependency and indebtedness that prevailed under the sharecropping system. As the size of the federal government expanded during the war, the number of blacks working as federal employees increased from 50,000 in 1933 to 200,000 in 1945. Membership of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People grew tenfold between 1940 and 1945. These developments would prove significant in the post-war civil rights movement. And let's continue on. Although World War II failed to remove the obstacles confronting blacks in America, it did significantly change demographic patterns. The lure of jobs in defense factories led to a surge in the Great Migration northward. Some 700,000 African Americans left homes in the rural South to relocate to the urban North during World War II. As African Americans moved north, they still faced hardship and discrimination. In Detroit, white mobs battled African Americans in the summer of 1933, resulting in the deaths of 25 blacks and 9 whites. At a Western Electric factory in Baltimore, white workers went on strike to protest the company's decision to integrate the workers' restrooms. Blacks faced almost universal discrimination when they tried to find homes or enroll in schools. Even in New York City, many restaurants and hotels continued to bar blacks. In New Jersey, movie theaters and bars near Fort Dix excluded black servicemen. While African Americans made many gains during the war, their double victory remained incomplete at the war's conclusion. And we'll stop here for this part and continue with the next video with the Zoot Suit Riots.